On this Thursday night, Ottawa's fall fiscal update. Is there relief on the way for the high cost of living?
I know that it has felt like just one thing after another.
I'll ask the finance minister if avoiding a recession is possible. Grocery giants accused of being greedy, the rapidly rising profits as soaring prices eat away at shoppers' wallets. Spiteful testimony from a Convoy leader.
Little Mr. Trudeau there in his boxing shorts with his juice box.
The latest tense exchanges at the Emergencies Act inquiry. And an American doctor's mission to help women seeking abortions and the danger he faces.
I thought that I would be assassinated.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. Every country in the world is worrying about its economic future right now. And today, Canada's finance minister and deputy prime minister outlined what she intends to do to help Canadians. Chrystia Freeland delivered a mini budget called a fall economic statement and said tough times are ahead.
It's important, as both the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance, that I'm honest with Canadians about the challenges that still lie ahead. Interest rates are rising as the Bank of Canada steps in to tackle inflation. And that means our economy is slowing down. It means there are people whose mortgage payments are rising.
Chief political correspondent David Akin is with me. David, we know all those things are true, and Freeland talked about helping Canadians who can't pay their bills and growing the economy at the same time. Neither are easy in this climate. How is the government saying it can do it?
Well, Donna, inflation, the cost of living is, clearly top of mind for most Canadians, and it is the top priority for the federal government.
And that's where I want to start. With the high cost of living, so many of us, so many Canadians are concerned about.
But despite the concern, this fall economic statement is thin on new ways to help. The government will tweak the payment schedule of the Canada Workers Benefit. It's a benefit paid to about 3 million Canadians, worth about $1,400 a year for single workers and $2,500 a year for households. It will now be paid out in quarterly installments rather than once a year at tax time. The government is also moving to permanently eliminate interest on federal student and apprentice loans. But that's about it.
The government's kept a lot of its powder dry to be able to make stronger moves in a number of areas that they've signaled in this fiscal update.
In fact, one of the biggest things the government is doing to fight inflation is not making it worse with huge new spending programs.
We really don't want to make the central bank's job harder. We don't want to put the Bank of Canada in a position where it has to raise rates higher.
It would take an awful lot of money to kind of move that economy and to be inflationary. So this really shouldn't be contributing.
The government also acknowledges economic growth will slow to a crawl next year, though it thinks Canada will avoid a recession. That said, a senior government official said if there is a recession in this country, it will be, quote, shallow and short. As to the fiscal bottom line, well, it's improving. When the government tabled the budget last spring, it thought the deficit this year would be about $53 billion. But the economy has been doing better than anticipated, giving Ottawa a windfall of about $30 billion. Now, some of that will be used to pay for things like doubling the GST tax credit. But about half of that windfall will go to reducing this year's deficit, now expected to clock in at about $36 billion. Speaking of deficits, this is the first time the Trudeau government has tabled any budget document since it was elected in 2015 that shows a balanced budget somewhere down the road. That's right. The Trudeau government says it will balance the budget, but not until 2028. Donna.
Okay. David Akin in Ottawa. Thanks. I'll talk to Chrystia Freeland a little bit later in the newscast. But first, we know costs are soaring for just about everything, and food prices are rising at the fastest rate in 40 years. Now, new research shows Canada's 3 biggest chains posted higher profits this year compared with their average performances over the last 5 years. And one company in particular really stands out. Neetu Garcha digs into the numbers and how the companies are responding.
Customers at this independent grocer in BC are searching for deals on produce.
There's lots of small independent green grocers especially. You can get really good produce at a much fairer price.
While food prices are rising at the fastest rate in more than 4 decades, major grocery chains are being accused of price gouging and so-called greedflation. New research suggests the country's top 3 grocers saw higher profits this year compared to their average performances over the last 5 years, and Loblaws is outperforming its best gross profit over that same period by $180 million.
Over the last 6 months, Loblaws has generated $1 million per day more than their record year, which is quite a bit. And so it begs the question whether or not these profits are coming from food sales or sales from other departments.
This Canadian researcher says a key issue is a lack of transparency, highlighting a need for companies to make their financial results more accessible. In the Canadian territories, it's a different picture. One of the few grocery retailers there, Northwest Co., and the biggest beneficiary of the federal Northern Food Program, saw a reduction in sales, but an increase in profits in the past year. In 2020, it saw an 82% rise in profits.
The government should probably be stepping in and taking some measures.
Some places, it seems like the profit margin is quite high. But if it were regulated, it would make a big difference.
The rising cost of food has prompted the Competition Bureau of Canada to study the industry as grocers defend their profits, saying margins haven't changed. Neetu Garcha, Global News.
A dire warning from the Bank of England today. Not only are interest rates jumping up, the UK is facing its longest recession since record-keeping began. The bank raised its base interest rate from 2.25 to 3%. That is the biggest jump since 1989, and it pushes borrowing costs to their highest rate since 2008. The governor of the Bank of England also says there's a tough road ahead for households. He says the recession could last 2 years, and the unemployment rate is forecast to nearly double by 2025. More of the people who claim to be in charge of the so-called Freedom Convoy earlier this year testified at the inquiry into the use of the Federal Emergencies Act, including a man who wanted to peacefully overthrow the government. What's becoming clear is how chaotic and divided the people who called themselves organizers of the protests really were. It was also revealed today how the movement was able to raise millions of dollars in funding. Abigail Beeman reports.
When we see our government completely violating all the laws.
I understand.
And where do we turn to? The Senate is our last hope.
James Botter pushed back on the idea that his now infamous MOU aimed to overthrow the government, even though it lists the unelected Senate and Governor General as representing itself as the government of Canada as a whole in a push to get rid of mandates. And under oath, he accused the actual government of treason.
We wanted to sit down with the Senate and say, here, we believe our government is committing treason. Enforce the laws, please.
Cross-examination by lawyers highlighted Botter's tendency towards conspiracy.
And you've shared on that Facebook hashtags for QAnon. There.
Yeah, so?
And that 9/11 was planned by a shadowy government body. Is that correct?
And hateful comments.
As an alpha male, trucker, oil patch, farm boy kind of guy, and seeing old little Mr. Trudeau there in his boxing shorts with his juice box water bottle sort of things, yeah, we call him Justine.
The commission also heard about infighting and discord between various convoy leaders. BJ Dichter said he dismissed Botter and the MOU.
It was a joke.
And didn't mince words about Jeremy Mackenzie, who testifies Friday.
He makes Mel Gibson look like a rabbi. He is really, really aggressive towards Jews.
The commission also learned about how much money rolled in and from where. In total, donors raised $24 million to support the convoy, $10 million through GoFundMe, $1.2 million through Bitcoin, and almost $12.5 million through Give, Send, Go, with nearly half that amount donated by Americans.
I felt that some people didn't see me. They just saw $10 million over my head.
Tamara Leach launched the GoFundMe. Money first went to a TD account in her name. She learned funds were frozen when trying to pay for a charter flight to bring convoy lawyers and others, including her husband, to Ottawa.
Did you consult with the Finance Committee before attempting to use the money for that purpose?
I don't believe I did.
Do you know why
you...
Most of the convoy money since returned to donors, millions still held in escrow. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
One-on-one with Canada's finance minister coming up. I asked Chrystia Freeland about Ottawa's fall fiscal update and whether avoiding a recession is possible. We know Canadians are struggling to keep up with their bills. And with me from Ottawa now is Federal Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, who delivered a fall fiscal update earlier today. Ms. Freeland, thanks for taking time for us. You know, economists have warned that a recession is coming. You're projecting two scenarios, a soft landing and a hard landing. I know there is a lot of uncertainty, but what will it take to hit that soft landing and avoid a recession?
Well, let me just say one thing, Donna, on our base case scenario, which is the soft landing scenario. And I know you know this very well, but Canada has this great practice to keep all the politics out of our budget process. So that base case scenario, it's not written by me or by the brilliant economists here in the Department of Finance. It's the average of private sector economists we surveyed in September. So that's entirely objective. That's what the private sector was telling us. Now, you're right. We also have a downside scenario because, as you have pointed out, some people have become a little more pessimistic. And we thought it was important, transparent with Canadians about that. And also, frankly, to show them that we stress tested the federal finances. And we can show you that even if things get a little worse, Canada is going to be.
I know you said you can't compensate every Canadian struggling with the rising cost of living, but people do want some solutions. Is what is in this mini budget enough?
There are a lot of solutions in this fall economic statement that can make a lot of difference for a lot of people. And I want to highlight the one thing that is maybe the most important for me that I announced today, and that is that tomorrow, our GST credit is going to give nearly $500 to Canadian families who need it the most. That is going to start arriving tomorrow in people's bank accounts, in their mailbox. That goes to 11 million Canadian households. That's going to make a difference right now when people really need it.
You talked today about keeping Canada's fiscal powder dry. What does that actually mean, and what are you reserving it for?
Donna, that is a great question. And what that means is that we get it. We get that now is a really worrying time for a lot of Canadians. And it is understandable that people would be worried. We had 2.5 years of COVID. Who could have imagined that? And things seem to change every month. And then we had this horrible thing of Putin invading Ukraine. And now we have inflation, something we haven't experienced in a generation. And people are talking about how maybe the global economy is going to get even tougher. So I think a lot of Canadians are really anxious. And when I say we're keeping our fiscal firepower dry, what I mean is Canada is strong. The federal government has the resources to support Canadians come what may. And I really hope and believe that Canadians should take a lot of reassurance.
Okay, quick answer to this one, if you could. In the spring, you imposed a one-time windfall tax on banks and insurance company profits. Now oil and gas companies are making record profits. President Biden calls it war profiteering. Shell's CEO said today he's willing to pay higher taxes. The NDP are calling for it. What's stopping you?
Well, I think we have done a smart thing when it comes to corporate taxation in this fall economic state. And that is to introduce a tax on share buyback. It's at 2%. And what that is going to do is it's going to raise a meaningful amount of money, more than $2 billion over 5 years. But also it is creating the right incentive for Canadian companies. And what that tax says is if you have enough money to buy back your shares, how about instead of buying back your shares, you invest that money in your company, in your productivity, you invest that money in your workers. So I think that is a smart way to go. It's a way to encourage something we really need, which is companies to be investing more in Canada, companies to be investing more in Canadian workers.
All right, Chrystia Freeland, Deputy Prime Minister, Finance Minister, thanks. No deal ahead. Mediation with Ontario education workers ends. What it means for students. Talks have now broken down between the Ontario government and the union representing the province's education workers. The education minister says his government is going ahead with legislation to impose a contract and ban a strike. The union says its members intend to walk off the job tomorrow. Colin D'Mello joins me from Queen's Park in Toronto. Colin, is there any room to maneuver now, or is this strike inevitable?
The strike is inevitable. The negotiations have concluded. The mediators dismissed the two sides, Donna, feeling that they were too far apart and there would not be a deal. And so the Ford government resorted to an extraordinary measure. They imposed the notwithstanding clause, imposing a contract on 55,000 education support workers. They are retaliating. They announced that they will be going on strike regardless beginning tomorrow, and they haven't really given us a deadline for when they would return to the job. They say the strike as of now is indefinite, which means the parents of 2 million children are now just holding their collective breath, waiting for news on when this will all end and how.
And Colin, what did the education minister say today about the repercussions against the workers who do strike?
Well, baked into this legislation that imposes this contract are stiff fines for any CUPE member that decides to walk off the job. $4,000 per individual per day, and the union could face a fine of a daily $500,000 for every day that they're off the job. The education minister says this is an illegal strike, and he intends to enforce it using those tools, using those very hefty fines. Although behind the scenes, Donna, the Premier's staff tell me that he doesn't want to necessarily use those fines on the frontline workers because it would run contrary to Premier Doug Ford's brand, which is sticking up for the little guy. Just as the Ford government here uses the notwithstanding clause to impose a contract never before seen in this province on the little guy.
All right, lots to watch for on this story. Colin D'Mello in Toronto for now. Thanks. Providing high-risk care next, the American abortion doctor who puts his life on the line to help patients. Abortion has emerged as a big issue in the upcoming midterm elections in the U.S. That was expected after the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, the landmark ruling that made abortion legal in 1973. For patients and doctors, though, it's much more than political. It is deeply personal. In both Canada and the U.S., 90% of abortions take place in the first trimester. But in the U.S., now that access has been reduced, some women have no choice but to wait longer. Farah Nasser spoke to one of the few doctors performing high-risk, late-term abortions.
For 50 years, Dr. Warren Hearn has made it his life's work to provide access to abortion.
It's my work. It's what I do. And I'm committed to doing it. Have been for a long time.
Dr. Hearn runs this clinic in Boulder, Colorado, one of very few specializing in the most difficult and sensitive areas, women in need of late abortions. Here on intake day, these seats will be filled with women in exceptional circumstances.
A very large proportion of my patients have fetal abnormalities with a desired pregnancy. They don't want to have an abortion, they want to have a baby. Or their own medical problem that threatens their life. We have somebody who's living in her car with her children who can't afford to have another child.
His dedication to women's reproductive rights began before abortion was even legal.
I was struck by the desperation of the women. During that time, there was a woman who went to Denver General Hospital to have an abortion, and they wouldn't help her. She went home and shot herself in the uterus, and then drove herself to the hospital.
Since then, he's treated some of the most vulnerable.
On a typical week, a third of my patients are adolescents at the age of 13, 14, 15 years old.
And some of them raped?
Yeah, by a family member or somebody else.
Dr. Hearn has seen patients as young as 10 years old, and he's watched abortion laws come full circle.
In a landmark ruling, the Supreme Court today legalized abortions.
I was there on December the 13th, 1971, when Sarah Weddington argued the Roe v. Wade case for the first time. This has affected the lives of tens of millions of women in this country for the worse.
How important are these midterm elections?
Critical. The plan since 1973 to overturn Roe versus Wade, and the Republican process, the politics have been designed for that, and they achieved their objective. Many women who come in to see us have very unusual and difficult circumstances. Some of them now are not able to get early abortions because the Republicans have shut down the abortion clinics all over the country.
And in spite of the challenges like getting bullets shot at his window and facing death threats, he continues to work at great risk.
I can't go out the front door when the anti-abortion demonstrators are out there because I have to assume that they're carrying weapons and they'll kill me if they have a chance.
In order to even get access to the clinic, you have to go through 1, 2, 3, 4 secure and bulletproof doors, plus 24/7 security camera surveillance. You bought the other building for security?
Yeah, because I didn't want a gun pointed at me from one of the offices.
You're 84 years old?
Yeah.
How long are you going to keep doing this?
I don't know, as long as I can.
Closing the door to a peaceful retirement and continuing a life of service to women in need.
Hello?
Farah Nasser, Global News, Boulder, Colorado.
That is Global National for this Thursday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is Onaway Centennial Park in Onaway, Alberta. We'd love to see your Canada. Please email it to viewers@globalnational.com. And thanks for watching. Farah Nasser will be at the anchor desk tomorrow. I'll see you Saturday for the new reality and next week from Washington, D.C. Bye-bye.